Question about a podcast between Jay Bhattacharya and Brian Keating on the Into the Impossible podcast by Brian Keating. I want to discuss Jay's revelations in the conversation. I also want to applaud Brian for having him on. Jay Bhattacharya is a very controversial figure because of his stance against some of the COVID measures that were taken. I want to discuss this partly politically, but also from an epistemological perspective. In other words, I think this whole conversation, if you just strip all the politics away, has also really important epistemological significance. In other words, it helps us answer the question, what is science? What's the purpose of science? And I want to talk about these things. This is Not Even Wrong podcast. It's December 16th, 2022. This is Krim Delco for the day. The fund is down 1.5%. The market is down 1%. For the year, we're down 65%. The market's down 17%. We're underperforming by 48%. The massive underperformance keeps, unfortunately, hurting us in many ways, particularly financially, but also morally and physically and everythingly, because what Elon Musk is doing is really, really difficult. I wrote a piece recently and also had a podcast about this, that being long Tesla at this point feels like having a girlfriend that you're embarrassed to admit that she's crazy, but you kind of still hang on to her. I think Musk needs to separate himself from Tesla, he needs to separate Twitter from Tesla, either by appointing a CEO for Tesla or appointing a CEO for Twitter, or at least give the market a clear guidance of how this is going to continue, because his distraction combined with the macro situation that is becoming worse and worse is a real concern. Today, for example, there is talk now about deterioration in the used car market and the bond market that is driving a lot of the financing of cars, and how these things are interrelated. Now, Tesla is part of the reason why the bond market eventually probably will collapse, because the used car bond market, the car bond market, the financing of cars is of course driven by residual values of cars, and if ICE cars residual values fall because electric cars are penetrating the market, then there is going to be a big problem on the bond market side. That is not being priced yet in the market, and that is a risk. And I believe that this will also impact Tesla. So we have to be very careful here. As far as we're concerned, we just have to manage our leverage, reduce our leverage to the bare minimum, if not even completely get rid of the leverage, which we still haven't done. And maybe we should. That's a question for another podcast. But we certainly will have to reduce it further. Now, let's talk about the actual, the purpose of this episode, and which is to talk about the reaction to Jay Bhattacharya's appearance on Brian Keating's podcast, Into the Impossible. So Jay has been very vocal about some of the measures that have been taken during the COVID pandemic in the US, particularly the lockdowns and also the school closures. He's been very vocal about opening up schools, letting children, try to have them live as normal lives as possible, because of the big damage that these COVID measures were taking on the kids. What he did, he tried to reason with science, and he was shut down by the scientists. And this is really the big revelation of this podcast, of his appearance and his conversation that he's having right now. It's not even about who was right or wrong during COVID or anything like that. It is really about how the scientific establishment, driven by the bureaucrats in Washington who are in charge of public health, has systematically tried to shut him down. It was the bureaucrats in Washington, but then also, of course, the media, places like Twitter, but also almost any other media outlet, particularly the so-called left-leaning media outlets, have been shutting him down. And this is really the concerning thing. I mean, there's an email that he shares between some people in Washington that around Anthony Fauci and other people like that who had power in the public health space, who just deliberately wanted him and his collaborators to be shut down. Now let's talk about the actual facts. So what Jay did, he wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal where he openly discussed one big number, which is the death rate that was being floated around by the World Health Organization, WHO, yes. So what they were saying is that the death rate of COVID is something like 3-4%. And he was questioning this number because he was saying that from the people who get infected and the people who die, that this quotient is needs to be analyzed very carefully. Now, it could be, of course, 3% or 4%, but most likely it's not. And the reason Jay was conjecturing that it's probably much lower is simply because of his experience. He had experience with, let's say, the SARS pandemic, and I think there were other pandemics, Nile virus and swine flu and things like that. So in general, he had experience that the WHO usually overstates the death rate, because what he was saying is that the people who actually die of the disease have to be divided by all the people get infected, and that the number of people get infected is very difficult to conjecture, and that at the time when the basically the public health establishment in the US and globally was proclaiming a very high death rate, that at that time it was almost impossible to know what the death rate is. So he was just cautioning about this, and this was the first sort of op-ed that created lots of controversy around him, and he started being attacked by colleagues and bureaucrats and politicians and so on and so forth. So he's trying to, what he's really saying is what I think we all sensed during COVID, which is that the pandemic is being politicized. There's one quote in the podcast which is particularly disturbing, where Jay says that he kind of got the feeling that the establishment wants the pandemic to happen and wants the pandemic to be bad. That was the feeling he got. That was the feeling that we shared also. I want to be clear about this. From our perspective, we are absolutely in line with anybody who stands behind the slogan, we should follow the science and not the scientists. That science is a form of inquiry and not a conclusion. So we're absolutely, the only thing we have as humans in this society that we live in this time is actually the scientific process of try and error correction. We don't have anything better, and that we should really follow this. So for example, we should try to understand what the death rate of a disease is. We should try to understand what the origins of a disease are. We should try to understand how to find cures for the disease. So, but there's no better way than science. But we can't just a priori make conclusions and then back them up with so-called science that is not that did not go through the rigorous process of try and error and critical analysis and so on and so forth. The other big thing that Jay did, he wrote a manifesto with other people, very well-regarded scientists, where he was basically propagating that lockdowns should be very reduced, if not completely undone, and in particular to protect the children and the vulnerable, which is the sort of lower income people and the children, which again is something that I instinctively felt during the lockdowns, because I was living back then in a very affluent neighborhood in San Francisco, and I just felt me and my neighbors and our family, we were fine. I mean, my son had full internet access. He was able to learn, not just even though the school was closed, he was able to study, but also we helped him as parents. We both, highly educated parents, so we were able to help him. Our neighbors were able to work, still pull a salary, all those kind of things, because they were, of course, all white-collar workers who worked from home, remote, and all that stuff. Versus if you were, let's say, a low-income person who worked in a restaurant or someplace like that, of course, you didn't have an income anymore. Your children, maybe you lived in a two-bedroom apartment with 4 kids, and maybe grandma and grandpa lived there, and all that kind of stuff, and you just didn't have you didn't have the space and the resources to educate your kids. So you had to send your kids to school, and when the schools closed, you were the most vulnerable. So this is kind of what Jay was trying to write in this manifesto, and that manifesto was then incredibly attacked by bureaucrats. He's showing emails about, and I don't want to mention here names, because not because I don't want to mention them, because I'm not quite sure which organization, which president of which organization, and so on and so forth. Let's just use it as an umbrella term that powerful bureaucrats in Washington and also globally were attacking Jay and his collaborators about saying that lockdowns should be very, very carefully considered because they have a huge cost. So again, this is something that I personally instinctively felt, so I completely agree with Jay, and appalled about the reaction that he got to that. You see, that's the problem here. It's not even, let's say he could have been wrong. I mean, he could have been wrong. He could have, and he, judging by his personality, I think he'd be the first to assume, look, I was wrong about it. But to attack him a priori and to use science as a conclusion and not as a form of inquiry, that is the crime here. That is the crime against epistemology. That is the crime against the progress our society has, because the only progress we have is science, freedom, the freedom of inquiry, the freedom of conclusion, the freedom of critical thinking. If we take that away from people, then we have no progress. And this is unfortunately what the health establishment did. Now, in hindsight, we know that a lot of what Jay was saying was right. For example, the fact that you don't have to do lockdowns and you're still going to have the same, if not better results is now true, because we see Sweden is doing fine. Other countries that have very, very less that were much less restrictive with lockdowns are doing better, if not, much better. I'd say take Texas or Florida versus New York and California. There's no difference. In fact, actually, their economies are much stronger now, and the people are much better off in those places than, let's say, in the places like California and New York, where the lockdowns were more severe. So we have data now. We have evidence that that Jay's cautionary comments were correct. And even today, still people refuse to acknowledge. I mean, this is again a quote from his appearance on the podcast, where he says, let's say, some journalists who attacked him and his family are still not apologizing, are still, going around saying basically that he's the bad guy. And that's really the disappointing thing. And now let's talk a little bit about epistemology, about political philosophy and those kinds of things, because I think this is a very important sort of crossroads in the development of humanity, particularly in our time, in contemporary times, where I think we're slowly slipping into some sort of collectivist thought coercion that is happening across our university campuses. It's happening in politics. It's happening in companies, corporations, and we need to stand up to that. We cannot let that happen, because it's really our duty as adults to leave a better place for our kids. And I think if we take away freedom of thought, if we impose thought coercion on ourselves and our kids, we're not going to leave a better place for our kids. So this is the most important fight of our generation. I think Jay is a proponent of that. He is an incredibly valuable human being. I think he is humble. He is happy to acknowledge mistakes. He's happy to forgive people. All of that I think a strong human being should show. And but he's not giving up on the process, and he's not apologizing. And this is very important. I think we all need to stand up. We cannot apologize for, let's say, attacking somebody like Anthony Fauci because he was wrong. We can forgive him if he acknowledges his mistakes, and we can go on. As we don't even have to punish people. I'm not too much into punishment and coercion on both ways. But what I want is just a process to continue and to be based on the fundamentals of freedom, of free thought, and cooperation and less coercion. We need to figure out ways to prevent something like COVID to happen again. We need to figure out ways and have answers to, let's say, how should we deal with pandemics if they happen again? And I think the answer cannot be we print $5 trillion and lock everybody down, because the cost of that is now showing. One of the big problems that few people are actually discussing is the role that Jay Powell and the Federal Reserve played in this pandemic. And this is the big gorilla in the room here. We have this money printing institution called the Federal Reserve, and we have rogue bureaucrats like Anthony Fauci and his collaborators who just single-handedly close our economy and the global economy. And then we have the Fed printing money, so the cost is not clear. And if the cost is not clear, you tend to make very bad decisions. And this was one very, very bad decision. In other words, if people like Fauci were presented with the cost, that if you close this down, the GDP will collapse by 50%, and people will be they won't have money to pay for food and rent and all that, then, we wouldn't have done it. We would have found better solutions. Under the constraint of resource constraint, we would have found better solutions. So the Federal Reserve has a big role to play here. I think this goes back to what Safedin Ammous calls the fiat standard, where if we have fiat money and fiat bureaucrats and fiat politicians, then we will tend to make bad decisions, because when money is free, we usually do things that we finance platitudes and egos and vanity, and not necessarily what's right for everybody. And the primary example that Safedin always uses is war. Let's say in the old times when money was gold and silver, even kings, they were very careful with war, and they would stop, let's say, a battle very early on if they thought that they can't win it anymore, because it was their gold that was being wasted on that war. Today we print money, we can keep with the platitudes and the vanity until much more damage is done, because money is, at least in the short term, free. It's instant gratification. I can print money and spend it right away, while of course in the long term, money printing doesn't help anybody. It destroys the economy, it destroys people's wealth, and it only benefits those few who got the money first and were able to spend it before the inflation skyrockets. So let's get back to my reaction conversation to Jay Bhattacharya's appearance on Brian Keating's podcast, Into the Impossible. I think what Jay did is enormous courage. He showed enormous courage. He might have been wrong in a few things. I don't care about that, because he showed us, he opened our eyes to the danger of the sort of industrial public health complex that has grown in the United States to enormous proportions. Half of the trillions and trillions of dollars of debt that our nation has are wasted on the medical community and the medical and healthcare community. And this industrial healthcare complex, unfortunately, is one of the biggest cancers of our society. I think the pandemic has just shown the peak of the iceberg, that some rogue bureaucrats can really damage us massively, our economy, our livelihoods. For example, right now we're having a big flu season. And why do we have a flu season? Because we were locked down for 3 years and didn't mingle and didn't have immunity against whatever flu virus was coming next. And now we're paying that price. And I don't know what the numbers are. I wouldn't be shocked if the death rate is pretty high. But at this point, of course, this industrial health complex is not really happy to communicate those numbers, because it could backfire, particularly also if we have sort of left-leaning White House right now. So they don't want that to be perceived as a failure and all those kinds of things. And I'm just, I guess, what I'm trying to say here as a summary is that we have nothing but science, and science is the form of inquiry. That is the best we have, and we need to cherish it with everything we have. We need to put all our resources. The fight of this generation is to prevail in the pursuit of science as a form of inquiry, and not let scientists take power away from us in the name of science and use science as a conclusion. That is the biggest fight that we need to fight. I encourage everybody to put their little contribution to this, which is often, like I always say, it starts at the kitchen table at home. You talk to your kids, you explain them, look, if your school closes because the teachers are scared of getting sick, then that's fine. But let's critically question that action. Let's try to understand, what are the consequences of closing a school versus opening a school? What are the consequences of not educating children? Let's have a critical conversation. Let's try to use data and do an analysis. We can also have a theoretical conversation about this, a philosophical if you want, but let's have a conversation. Let's not shut people down. Let's not intimidate people. That is not the right path forward. And if we want to leave a better world for our kids, we have to fight this fight and preserve the science and the form of inquiry that we've built over the last couple hundred years. Thank you.